We're in 1 Corinthians 11. We are in 1 Corinthians 11, and we're going to look at verses 2 through 16. So this is the next subject that Paul is covering in Corinth. This is the shortest section so far, and it is 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. And just a little reminder, if you remember the structure of the letter to the Corinthians, obviously it's based on somebody traveled to Paul with a letter or came orally, and they said to Paul, here's all the problems that are going on in the church of Corinth. We have a problem with this, we have a problem with this, we have a problem with this. There's this dude who's sleeping with his dad's wife, and they just go and they list all these issues. And so this letter is Paul's response to all of the problems in the church of Corinth. And the shortest section that we've looked at so far is the one that we're going to see this morning. The entirety of it is 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. Since the beginning of the 20th century, our society has had a growing obsession in the empowerment of women. Some of it has been good, some of it has been wonderful. Women should be able to vote. They should be able to make an informed decision on whether or not to stay home with their kids or go in to work. And it should be far easier for women to find a place of work so that they don't need to depend solely on men if there's a situation of abuse. We want women to feel like it is easy and they are capable of getting out from underneath that man in their lives. At the same time, though, I also believe that the women's rights movement has moved in such a direction that it is now destroying the lives of women across the globe by erasing their dignity, their protection, and their power. Women are moving into a place where they are losing the possession they should have of being nurtured and honored and loved in godly marriage relationships. Women are being told that they can have everything, and then when they try to have everything, it makes them miserable. And so what we're doing is destroying femininity. We are destroying the glory that God gave to the female gender. As a way to just illustrate this, I think the way that it's most dramatically seen in our society right now is that in the 1990s, if you were to study the issue of transgenderism, so that is men who want to be women, women who desire to be men, transgenderism among girls and teens was so small that it wasn't even an observable portion of society. Transgenderism was almost exclusively a male issue up through all of human history. It was men who wanted to be women. Most often it came as the result of abuse in their life. Fast forward 20 years from when I grew up, and in 2016, we've now made it to the point where just 5 years ago, now 0.7, so nearly 1% of teens considered themselves to be transgender, and it was about 50-50 between boys and girls who desired to sort of escape their gender and be the opposite. And now fast forward only 5 years, so from 2016 to now 2021, so in a change of 5 years, now 2% of teens, 1 in 50 claim to be transgender, and almost the entire growth of that is in girls who would prefer to be boys. By trying to empower women, by making them into men, by stating things like there's no difference between men and women, and gender is a social construct, we're causing a lot of women and girls to really hate being women. The women's liberation movement is destroying the beauty of womanhood. Just think about how now mothers are being called birthing persons at this point. Breastfeeding has been changed in titles in scientific literature from breastfeeding to chest feeding a parent's milk to a child. We're getting rid of femininity and the glory that comes with womanhood. I start there because the subject that we're looking at in 1 Corinthians 11, head coverings on women and women in submission to their husbands, is something that seems so archaic that it is almost comical that anyone would consider this. But I want to be clear, what we're doing right now for women is not working. Women are more miserable than ever. Women are drinking and becoming drunks and alcoholics more than they have ever in human history. Watching pornography is becoming more and more common for women. We are imprisoning women in lust and depression through our culture and society today, and God would like us to release them for the freedom that they were intended to live. So we start this discussion on head coverings for women by looking at the role that God had intended for every person to have in creation. So we'll start with verses 2 and 3, looking at our roles in creation. Now I praise you, because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. So Paul begins this discussion on head coverings by reminding everyone of the authority structure that God established in creation. And I think the interesting part about verse 3 when he talks about the order of the structure here is that it's a little odd. And so we want to say, what's the significance of this odd order that Paul states it? So here first, though, is the basic authority structure for creation. It is to be God, then Christ, then man, then woman. So in the same way that God the Father has authority over Christ the Son, Christ has authority over man, man is to have authority over woman. This is the role, the design that God intends to have for creation. And what I meant by the order that Paul brings it in is odd, and what's odd about it is that the part of authority that should have come first in order, Paul put it last. Paul should have started with God is the head of Christ, because that's the highest, and then you have Christ who's in submission to the Father coming second, and then Christ and man. But Paul moved that to the final place. So what's the significance of having God and Christ come last? We can't specifically say why, but here's what I think is the best guess as to why. And that is Paul began with the order of Christ, man, woman, because that is the truth. That's how it was put forward when God created Adam and Eve. A man should lead his wife in love and kindness as Christ leads and loves the church. But due to our fallenness, this simple structure could lead men to do two things. One, because of the structure, it could lead men to be domineering over women in their leadership. Men are not to dominate women, but they are to cherish them, nurture them, give them grace and mercy and kindness and compassion. Second, it could lead men to devalue women. It could cause men to say, well, since it's God, Christ, man, woman, well, that must mean that us men are more important than you women. That was not supposed to happen either. And Paul sees that possibility, so he adds God is the head of Christ to show, one, first, that husbands are to give the same love, honor, respect, and devotion to their wives and to the women in their life as our Father gives to Jesus Christ. So the authority that men have over women is not to be a dominating authority, is not to be, we're going to go my way or the highway. I'm the man. You need to be quiet. Go out and make me a sandwich. Not that way at all. But we're to give the same value and glory to the women in our lives as the Father gave to the Son. And in the same way that Jesus, the Son, also has the same value, worth, and dignity as God the Father, we would not say that Jesus is less than God the Father. They are co-equal in glory. They are co-equal in power. In the same way, we need to look at men and women in the same way. These roles that we have between men and women are not to say that men are more valuable, men are more worthy, men are more important, but both men and women are to have equal value and importance in the eyes of God. The position of headship must not be used by men, but it must not be abused by men, but it must be used to honor, cherish, and serve the women in our lives through a position of leadership. So this establishes sort of a baseline for us, that when we talk about this subject of head coverings, it should never be put forward in any type of way that shows a devalue or a humiliation of a woman in comparison to a man, because to do that is to miss the whole point of the way that men and women are to relate together. And then this brings us to what they actually wrote to Paul about, which is, should women wear head coverings when they pray? And this is what Paul wrote in verses 4 through 9. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and the glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. So in these verses 4 through 9, Paul gives two commands, or sort of how he words them in these verses, two traditions for the church. And I think it's important that Paul is using this language of traditions here. And the tradition for men is, men, when you pray, don't cover your head. So if I got my Yankees cap on and we're going to pray, I should take that hat off. So men, do not cover your heads when you pray. And I would say the vast majority of men still follow this. When we pray, we take our hands off when we go before God. The sticky issue, though, is the second tradition, which is women. Cover your heads when you pray. And the vast majority of women do not follow this today. And most of this section is actually Paul just talking about how disgraceful it is for women to pray with their heads uncovered. He's basically saying, if you pray with your head uncovered, it's just like shaving your head and walking around looking like me or like Jim. And Paul says no woman wants to look like Sean or Jim, so don't do that. So the question is for us, why is it a disgrace for a woman to not cover her head while she prays? Oh, I should have said Glenn too. Sorry, Glenn, I didn't put you in the bald man club. So I got to make sure I include all of us together. We gotta, yeah, Tony, yeah, great. Thanks for pointing that out. You got a lovely head of hair there. So Paul gives two reasons why it is a disgrace for a woman not to cover her head when she prays. The first is in verse 7, and the second is in verse 10. The first relates to a woman's humility. The second relates to a woman's authority. A woman should cover her head since she is the glory of man. So how is a woman a man's glory? Well, Paul says that in the same way a man is a reflection of God's image and God's glory, so too is a woman a reflection of man's glory. So whenever a man walks in righteousness and truth, when we live how God desires us to live, we are a reflection of God and we bring glory and praise to God's name. So when Glenn loves Kathleen as Christ loves the church, that's a reflection of God's glory in his life. When Don brings food to feed the boys that come in on Sunday morning, that's a reflection of the compassion of Jesus Christ. And those are glorifying God with the way that we live. Well, women, especially wives, through their walk in righteousness, through their humility, they glorify their husbands. They glorify their fathers if they're unmarried and still in their father's home. And I think every husband can tell you from experience, there are times where, you look at your wife, or for me, like whenever Jen comes and sings at church or anything, I'm always like, yeah, that's It's my wife. Yeah, she can sing good. It brings glory to us. I love to boast about all the things that Jen does, doing all the homeschool with our kids, running Grace Girls, working part-time. And when people are like, how can Jen do so much during the day? I'm like, because my wife is awesome, and I am glorified in that. So the reason that a woman should cover her head when she comes before God in prayer, and this was much more significant in the first century world with the way that they viewed women's hair in comparison to our world today when we view women's hair, is that when a woman comes before God in a time of prayer and she has this beautiful flowing hair, the belief was, who is that woman glorifying with that great flowing hair? Well, it's her husband, because everybody else can look and say, wow, that guy's got to be lucky to be married to her. And we don't want to be thinking about how, Jim is so lucky to be married to Diana when we're in our time of prayer. We want to be thinking about how our focus is on God. So a woman should cover her hair so that all of her glory points to God in times of prayer and not to her husband. So that was the significance of it in the first century world. It was, we want a woman's hair to be covered so that everybody is not thinking about how, wow, that father, for him to have those beautiful girls, he is a lucky man to have that household. Or that husband with his beautiful wife, how blessed is he to have that woman with that wonderful hair? We don't want to be thinking about how a guy is receiving glory from the women in his life. We want all of it, and this is why it's limited to that time of prayer. When we're coming before God in prayer, we want to be bringing glory to him alone. But we've stopped practicing it because in our world today, let's be honest, I've never had a moment in my life, and I don't know if any of you have, where I've looked at a man and a woman together, and I've looked at the woman's hair and thought, oh man, that guy is lucky to be married to a woman with hair like that. We don't look at hair on women the same way today that they did in the first century world. The culture has just changed so dramatically that we don't have that same focus today anymore. I think my wife has the most amazing hair, but I don't think anybody's going to be, talking about how wonderful I am to be married to a girl with curly hair. And so the question is, how should we apply this today, since we don't view hair the same way today that we did in Paul's world? I think the key to this is that we need to make sure that when women are married especially, and even when they're living at home under their father's authority, that they're living in a way where they are humble. They are not specifically going out to draw attention to themselves. They are living in a way where everything's not going to be focused upon them, but the focus is going to be able to be upon the Lord because of the way that they are handling themselves, the way that they are walking, and the way that they are living. So the primary purpose of this head covering, and I think honestly, if you were to walk into church and somebody were to have a woman was to have her head covered, she would probably be drawing more attention to herself because we'd be thinking, why is she putting that on her head? But the key is when you're coming before God in prayer, don't do it in a way that you're showing that you and your family are spiritually superior or financially superior or socially superior to everyone else. Make sure that the focus is placed upon God alone. So that's really the key, is that when we gather together as people of God, that we are acting in such a way that the focus can be put upon the Lord. So that's not dressing in a way that's going to draw attention to yourself, but making sure that you're living and you're interacting in such a way that the focus is going to go upon God. So the key here is this aspect of humility. And I think really the reason that we don't do the head coverings anymore is that we just simply do not view a full head of women's hair today the way that we viewed it in the days of Paul. The culture has just changed that much that it is not seen the same way, and so that's why we do not practice it. And then the next reason, which I think is the really intriguing one that has led to a lot of controversy, is verse 10. So verse 10, here's the second reason that women should cover their hair. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So women should cover their heads because of angels. And understand what Paul is saying. The first thing we need to do is correct this terrible translation. This is not a good translation of verse 10. I went and looked through all the English translations that are out there. The only one that got this translation right by not adding extra words was the good old original King James Version. So here's the King James translation of 1 Corinthians 11:10. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. So there's nothing in the Greek text that says that the woman has a symbol of authority on her head, as if this is a sign that she's under her husband's authority. That's not what Paul wrote. Paul wrote that by having a head covering, what a woman does is she has power. She has authority because of the head covering. I mean, I read one Greek scholar's comments on this verse, and he was like fuming mad that they turned this into a statement on humility, because he's like, there's no way that you could ever make these Greek terms mean a symbol of authority. They do not mean that. It is only because you want them to mean that you butcher the translation. The head covering is to be power. It is to be authority for the woman. And so it's not about her humility, but it is about her power, and it is about her authority, specifically related to the angels. So what does that mean, that a woman has power and authority as related to the angels? There's two different theories that this has been brought up. The first one, I think when you translate it right, you can easily just knock this one off. Some people have said this could be in some way related to Genesis chapter 6. If you remember, right before the fall in Genesis 6, the sons of God, who are angels, saw the daughters of men, and they thought, hey, they're pretty. And they came down and married them and had giant children. And so some people are saying that this is related to making sure that angels do not lust over women, and that's why they need to have this head covering. That doesn't fit with the power and authority. I think the verse that more closely relates to what's going on here is in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14. Speaking of our relationship to angels, it says, are they, that is angels, not all ministering spirits, sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? So what we read in Hebrews, we also see this pictured in the narrative in the book of Daniel, that the saints who are inheriting salvation, that when we pray to God, angels are dispatched for our goodness. We don't know how angels are working on our behalf, but we know in some way, according to Hebrews and Daniel and various other stories, that angels are working on behalf of God's people. So while women wearing head coverings, according to Paul, they are displaying the authority that they have over the angels. So this head covering is a sign of their power and a sign of their authority to direct and demand the angels to serve over their lives. And it's like, how does that work? Well, if you go back to the original authority structure that Paul talked about in verse 3, the original authority structure is there is God the Father, he's first, and then he sent God the Son, Jesus Christ. So while Jesus and the Father are co-equal in glory and honor and power, the Son has willingly put himself in submission below the Father. So there's the Father, there's the Son, and then there's man who is underneath Christ. Christ loves the church. And then there is woman. So if a woman exercises authority in the midst of the command structure of Father, Son, man, woman, what she is doing by calling upon angels in prayer is she's saying, I'm not speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not coming before the angels through my glory and my worth and my beauty and because of what you should be doing for me. She's saying, I am calling on my submission below my husband, below Christ, below God, for these prayers to be answered for me. So this is a way of a woman saying that I'm having power not in myself, but in the line of submission before underneath God the Father, Jesus Christ, my husband, and then myself. So this is a woman saying, I have not just authority in who I am, but I have authority in God the Father himself in the role in which he has placed me. And Paul's saying here that if a woman is refusing to wear a head covering, refusing to have to put forward the authority that she should have under her husband and Christ, she loses the power that she has over angels. So the question is, how can a woman have this authority today when we don't practice head coverings? I think the way that a woman has this authority over angels is by living in submission and godliness in their homes to the glory of God. I believe a woman can exercise the same power and authority in her prayer life if she is living in such a way in her home, whether this is to her father or whether this is to her spouse, depending on what station she is in life, to bring glory to God by the way that she lives with the men that are in her life. So Paul's saying here, the purpose of a head covering is not to humiliate a woman, but it is to empower them. And I believe that whenever we live in God's plans, it will always empower us and never belittle us. So when Paul talks about being submissive, when Paul talks about head coverings, that is to be empowering in the church and not to be humiliating or belittling. We are all to live in submission to one another, so submission should never be seen as a dirty word in the church. And so Paul now then ends this section, verses 11 through 16, and I think his final point is just to drive home the emphasis that head coverings do not make a woman less than a man. And this is how he brings it up in these verses. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. So Paul's teaching here is, it's really extreme in comparison to the world in which Paul lived. It's tough for us to grasp how belittled and how powerless women were in comparison to men in the first century world. There was no one in that society who thought that women were in any way equal to man. That type of thinking did not exist. Everyone believed that men were stronger, men were smarter, men were more capable, men were better than women in every way. That was just the common thinking of that day. But Paul, in this last section, would have none of this. He is going out of his way in these verses to say that head coverings do not make a woman less. Women and men should be seen as equal in worth and value before God. A husband as the head of his wife does not make himself better than his wife, and it does not make his wife worse than them. The role of one person in the church as a teacher and the role of another person in the church as a listener does not make the teacher more important than the listener in the eyes of God. God the Father sent God the Son to this world, but both were equal in glory. So Paul is emphasizing in the church, we are not to see men as better than women. That's the point of that section where Paul says women is not independent of man and man is not independent of women. Because men, if you want to sit there and boast, hey, I can go back to Genesis and read how men were created first. So we must be more important because, you had to take that rib out of Adam. So we came first, so we're better. And Paul's like, you're an idiot because how did you come into this world? You were born out of a woman, you dummy. Women came from men and men came from women. It's the same. Men came first in creation, but in every single day of human existence, men come from women. So God has gone out of his way to show that one does not have priority over the other. And that's the ending portion of this, which was just something that was mind-blowing in that time period. I mean, if Paul was going to stay cultural, he would have just stopped at verse 10. He would have had the women are below men. The only way women have authority before angels is if they wear their head coverings. The end, in line of society. But by Paul throwing in this, no one is independent of anyone else, Paul is saying, you're all equal in value. You're all equal in glory. And the issue is that there were some women in Corinth who were saying, well, since we're equal in glory, I'm getting rid of the head covering. Now the woman's going to be the authority in the home. The wife's going to boss around her husband and tell her what to do. And Paul's like, okay, we are equal in value. We are equal in glory. We are equal in honor. We're all made in the image of God, but God has still set up an authority structure for the home, for the family, for the church, and we still need to operate in that structure. And just because the man is above the woman in God's structure, just because God has planned the husband to be the leader of the home instead of the wife, that does not mean that the wife is any less important. If you believe that, then you must also believe that God the Father is more worthy and more glorious and more holy than God the Son. That Jesus was humiliated and belittled to be sent in submission to this world. And none of us would ever say that. So in the same way that Christ is equal to God, so are man and woman equal together. Paul's major concern here is twofold, both under the category of prayer. His major concerns are, and I think this is what we need to focus on as a church if we want to know how to apply these passages to today in light of not using head coverings, is that the two key truths to remember is that first, when we come before prayer, and I think we could equally say this about men as about women, and that is when we go before God in prayer, the time must be focused on God. We got to make this focused on His glory, on His authority, on Jesus Christ and what He has done, and not make it focused on me and how I look and my status and who I'm superior to and drawing attention to myself. And the second thing is we want to make sure that when we're praying, we are doing it in such a way that we're not basing our authority on ourselves, but where we fall in God's authority structure so that we can ultimately reach to God the Father Himself and His authority when we seek to the answers for our prayers. And I think we can do that today without head coverings. And like I said, the big reason that we're not going to put that emphasis on head coverings today is because we do not see women's hair in the same way that they saw women's hair in the days of Paul. It's just totally different the way that we view that. And so that's the reason why we have altered that tradition. And if you look at how Paul speaks about it in these verses, he's even sort of using that traditional language. You know, the churches don't have any other traditions. So I think that the key, though, is that we're living in such a way that we're having godly authority structures in church and that men don't devalue women in the way that they treat them.